One of the big issues with CSS is understanding how the rules actually apply. This is the challenging topic of CSS specificity. One way to think about it is that CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So the cascading behavior is really what applies the rule set. So we could say that a rule that occurs in declaration style after another rule will be more important. So if we said something like, so if we define our two rules, both for the H1, the question is which one is going to apply. In order of hierarchy, it's the one that's closest to the element. So in this case, it will be this one that will apply. The problem is that this isn't always the case. Of course, if we get closer to the element when we do an inline style, that also takes precedence because it's closer to the element. But as I said, this isn't always the case. And this is where specificity comes into play. Specificity defines when two rules are talking about the same thing, which one applies. In this case, it's the most recent one. But what if we changed things up a little bit and added a class to this one? Now, if this one's a class and this one's an H1, which one is more important? Which one will apply? If the element has both the class and the H1, actually the class will apply. This will take precedence. What about if it was an ID? Which one will happen first? Even in this order, it won't matter. The ID takes precedence over classes and elements combined. So we start to get this confusion of who's telling it to do what, and how do we control that? So the more specific something is, the more likely it is to take control over the element and define its styles. Of course, because it's cascading, if this rule defined additional properties and left the font size alone, it wouldn't override font size and it would inherit from this rule. So inheritance is also important to remember. It's also important to show important. So an important rule, when defining a rule, we can use the exclamation point important to define that it overrides all specificity. Now I'm showing you this because you'll probably see it, but I am advising heavily against actually using it. This can really screw with a style sheet, and by using important it makes it very difficult to override specific styles, because now you've moved this anchor tag color into a new zone, a new level of specificity that we can't compete with unless we use another important. So if we ever want to override the color red on this anchor tag, we're going to have to use another important. And then if our whole style sheet is full of importance, then why did we use them in the first place? So be very, very wary of using this. So there is a way to calculate specificity, well, many ways, but the common idea is that it's a 4-value number. It's not a single number, it's a 4-part number. Each one of these parts can be used to define how specific a rule set is. And they travel in order of specificity. So our most specific element is the style attribute. This is an inline style, something we define in the HTML on our element. Next, we have the ID selector. So if our element has an ID and we select by ID using our CSS rule set, this will take over the next level of precedence. Next, we have the class selector. This also includes attributes and pseudo selectors. And finally, our least specific one are the elements. An example of the style attribute might be something like, so this will be the most specific. Next, with an ID selector, that'll be the next most specific. With a class selector, or a pseudo selector, these will be the next most specific. And finally, we have the least specific. The way that these rules work is for every occurrence of a specific selector in a single rule definition will increase one of these values. So if we have a selector that looks something like, we can go through and actually calculate the specificity of this rule. We've got two element selectors. We've got a pseudo selector and a class selector. So the specificity of this is 0022. Now this isn't a base 10 system. So when we add these numbers, when we increase these values, we can't override another section. For example, if maybe we say we have 11 element selectors in this one, that simply becomes an 11. It won't override something that has a class selector of 1. This will not override that. And as we increase, we could say we have an ID selector. So now we've increased this specificity by adding an ID. So calculating this, we have two element selectors. We have a pseudo selector and a class selector. We have a single ID selector. So the specificity of this is 0122. There are lots of resources online and charts that you can find that will help you calculate the specificity of your rules. A general rule of thumb for this is keep your selectors small. The smaller these are, the easier they are to override when you get to a point where you need to be more specific about which element is receiving a unique style. So in terms of architecture and planning out your specificity and your selectors, you want to keep them as small and as minimal as possible to help yourself in the future.